Did you know there's an inhuman monster lurking at Mount Rainier National Park? Whatever it is, people report that it's tall and apparently has some violent mood swings. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and you should follow me on Twitter @DarkPrevails to check out this super sick tornado video I found. Today I've got an assortment of terrifying tales for you featuring skinwalkers, hiking horrors, and more. Enjoy, and don't forget to send me your scary stories of the unexplained at darkstories.org or go to eeriecast.com to check out our other shows. My friend, The Disciple, will be helping me narrate a couple of stories today. You can find more of their narrations with the link in the description. Before we start, I just want to announce my first novel is finally finished. Well, to be upfront, the story was my idea, but a ghostwriter was hired to write it out. It's called Drakenblood, The Malformed King. Drakenblood is a horror fantasy adventure with grotesque monsters, raining blood, and a fallen kingdom. It was heavily inspired by Bloodborne. The ebook of Drakenblood is now available for pre-order for just under $5. Just click the link in the description or go to eeriecast.com and click shop at the top right. And hey, if you're a member of EerieCast Plus, you can read it right now on your account. Thank you. Now, let's begin. Possible Skinwalker in Indiana Cornfields. From Joey B. This happened a couple of years ago. I believe I had just turned 14. My parents and I had made the long drive to go visit my grandparents, whom we didn't really talk to very much. There was some drama that went down in the past, and my parents tried to keep me away from that as much as possible. Though in the years leading up to this trip, things had supposedly calmed down. Additionally, my grandparents were on the older side, and I think my parents kind of recognized that the end was near. We pulled up to a run-down house in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by seemingly endless amounts of cornfields. It was there I met my grandparents for the first time in years. It didn't take me long to recognize they were very cold people. And being a 14-year-old kid, I kind of just gave up on trying to get to know them. I sat on my phone for the first couple hours. We would only be spending one night, then leaving the next day. I remember it was close to the evening when I was so incredibly bored, I just needed to do something. I made my way down a dirt road, surrounded by cornfields on either side. I couldn't see the sunset very well at all because a layer of haze had descended from the sky, making it difficult to see much of anything far in the distance. As the sun continued to set, it got darker and darker. Eventually, I gave up trying to find a decent view of the sunset, so I decided to head back to the house. On my way back, I noticed something strange. I couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else, but the rustling of the cornfields gave off an eerie feeling. My surroundings continued to darken. I still had a decent walk back to the house, so I picked up my pace. I began to see things on the road in front of me, which I had not noticed prior. The deceased bodies of animals littered the road. They didn't look like typical roadkill, though. They were too mangled. I ignored it the best I could and continued to walk. Between the haze and darkness, my visibility was horrible at this point. I eventually came to an area in the road where the cornfields on each side of the road were elevated. I felt a sense of dread wash over me. I wasn't sure why, but then something spoke.
Joey.
Spoke this raspy voice suddenly. I couldn't tell which side the voice came from. "Hello?" I replied. "Who are you?" The voice replied,
"A friend. Come here."
Somehow the voice seemed recognizable, but at the same time it was like I'd never heard it before. I was frozen. It was so strange. A part of me felt drawn to the fields. I wanted to go and see my friend. Then suddenly I snapped back to reality. This was beyond wrong.
Joey, I can see you, Joey.
The voice interrupted my thoughts. I cursed under my breath. I needed to get out of here. I was a pretty athletic kid. I played soccer after all. I knew there was a chance I could book it to the house. I counted down from 3 in my head. Then I took off running. I could hear rustling in the cornfield, more prominent than before. There was something big in there, something that didn't care about being stealthy any longer. I quickly made it to the house porch. I swung the door open and locked it behind me. I never told anyone about what happened. I tried to enjoy the rest of my night and brushed it off as my imagination. Later that night, as I was about to fall asleep, I went to shut the blinds on my window. The room I was staying in happened to have a view of the cornfield, which I'd come running from a couple of hours prior. I looked out the window for a moment. The haze had not fully disappeared, but there was enough light to see something abnormally tall standing in the field. I looked out for just a moment, trying to see if this strange dark shadow was even alive. It looked humanoid, but it stood just so still. Suddenly, it tilted its head to the side and ducked back into the cornfield. I felt sick. I knew it was that thing from before, I just knew it. I didn't sleep at all that night. I was more than grateful when we left the next morning. I never went back to that house again. Those grandparents passed away a couple of years later, and to my knowledge, the house was sold. I'll never ever be going back there to find out. Somebody else is going to have to figure out the nightmare that lives in those fields. I've heard stories about skinwalkers before, and this might be similar, but to be clear with you, I have no clue. Stay safe out there, everyone. Why I put the bins out in the morning. From RD in Hull. I can't help but wonder if this may be connected to my previous story, titled Stinker in the Fields, which was a detailed encounter with Hull's local dogman/werewolf back in 2002. Now, I'm not the healthiest of people. Back in 2020, I came down with a fairly bad chest infection, the long-term consequences of which have left my mobility and general health severely hampered. As a result, my sleep pattern is generally shot, and I spend a good chunk of time at my desk, be it passing out to sleep in a rather comfortable chair, or reading, writing, or doing mundane tasks. It's fairly close to one of my windows, and as a result, I often get a decent view of the street outside and the goings-on of the night. For the most part, there's not much happening. The odd drunk, the odd stray cat or dog, nothing too special. Now, there is a standard weekly practice. Each week the bins are put out, and my downstairs neighbor is rather passive-aggressive, so his current way of trying to cause problems for me is to put the bins out ridiculously early each week. The local council advises that the bin is to be put out on the morning of the collection day, between 6 to 7 a.m., but a lot of people tend to be a bit more lazy, putting the bin out the night before. This is fine, but should the bins end up damaged or stolen, the council treats that as the tenant's liability and responsibility to replace. However, my downstairs neighbor has taken this to new levels. The day before, the weekend before, at one point, an entire week before. Then he complains to the support workers that I never put the bins out, which is a bit rich, considering he's sticking them outside days in advance, and I'm not going to compete with him to see who can put the bins out earlier. The unfortunate consequences of this weren't too obvious until early one month. Downstairs had put the bins out 2 days early, rather frustratingly on a Saturday, which meant they would sit there until Tuesday. Now, recently, with my health declining as it had, I got back into a lot of the interests that I had forgotten about or had put to one side to be a responsible adult. I realized you simply cannot just carve out chunks of your life to be a good cog in the machine, because when you break, the machine doesn't care. One of these interests was the supernatural, cryptids and all that. I got to thinking more on odds and ends, and keeping an eye out more than I had. It was a Saturday night. I'd fallen asleep in my chair simply because the couch I used as a bed wasn't sitting right with me for some reason, and the recent heat wave made it really uncomfortable to do much other than be a puddle. My sleep pattern, being as erratic as it is, tends to mean I drift in and out for a few hours at a time, suffering fatigue and exhaustion during the day. As such, I woke up about 2 to 3 in the morning, as I usually do. After having a bit of a stretch and deciding to stand up, I looked outside my window. As to be expected, it was quiet. The windows were open, the street was fairly empty save the awkwardness of our bins having been shoved out onto the curbside. The air was pleasant, with just the right coolness to it. But it was at that point I realized something was off. It was quiet, but too quiet. It was uncanny. There was no traffic on the nearby roads, no cats yowling and fighting, not even the skittering of the odd rat. Just this cold, eerie stillness sitting in the area. If I were a smart man, I would have backed away, even closed the windows or pulled them as shut as I could without drawing attention. Instead, I continued to look out, glancing down the street. I live on a street where there is a row of terraced houses, which leads to a street of elderly bungalows at the bottom, and further streets splitting off of terraced houses north and south along that street. Connected to the southern streets is a footpath, which runs through a good chunk of the city, enclosed by trees and wild shrubbery, going through a number of more open and run-down areas. Not quite parks, but not quite wilderness. Just an attempt to tame it, such that it's a bit out of hand. People walk their dogs down there. People dump rubbish down there. For the most part, it's just a convenient cut-through to other parts of the city. From the bottom end of the street, I noticed a large figure. Huge, dark, heavily built, seemingly loping down the road. At first, I thought perhaps it's a stray dog, roaming down the street looking for scraps. A Saturday night would be ideal for a stray, as the average drunk will happily share their takeaway with a good pupper, and the homeless often take care of animals as well. But after a few moments of watching, in this cool silence, I realized this wasn't a dog. It was too big. The bins stand just shy of 4 feet in height, and this animal was coming up to them, hunched over, roughly the same height. I watched and frowned, the back of my mind starting to play back the events of some 21 years ago. And unfortunately, I got to see as it stood up roughly halfway down the street from my flat, from my bins. It towered over those bins, twice their height, and I watched as it seemed to be inspecting them, looking around them as though scavenging for food. I mean, why wouldn't it? A busy city, plenty of rubbish going out each day. And people quickly blame kids playing pranks or spiteful neighbors for knocked over bins with contents scattered about. No one would ever think of a dog man, not a werewolf as a likely candidate. My heart raced. I shrank down against the wall, peeking out the window cautiously as the beast dropped down and continued to lope down the street, bin to bin. It would sniff each one. If a lid was slightly ajar, it would pry it open to root around inside. I suppose the good thing about everyone's bins going out so early is that they weren't as full as they should be, so this beast was finding very little to work with. But then I watched, in deathly silence, as it approached my bins. The smell of it hit me first, the same rotting smell I'd gotten a whiff of some 20 years earlier. The smell that gave it its name, Old Stinker, and I watched nervously as it lifted the bins and started to root about. I could hear it snorting and snuffling. I could hear the bin liners rustling a little as it tugged and poked at them, searching for anything. I remained as silent as I could as I watched, just waiting and hoping this thing would go away. Why was it here? At my home of all places? Well, I knew that, but my mind was panicking at the time. It was at that point that my health, my body, decided to betray me and make things awkward. Because I coughed. I quickly tried to silence it, hacking up into a tissue and covering my mouth as I ducked down. But I heard the curious snort and sniff of the beast. I knew it heard me. For a moment, there was silence. Then I heard the dull thunk of the bin lid dropping. I glanced downward, briefly, to see the beast curiously loping up the small pathway into the very small garden. Naturally, this made a bit of noise. An overgrown hedge caught it, rustling a bit. Its attempts to turn itself about to avoid that caused it to knock into other bins in the garden. And this drew other attention it did not want. I could hear downstairs starting to stir, pounding on his window and shouting. I glanced to see lights coming on across the road, and I even heard another neighbor starting to gripe about whoever was making that noise. In those chaotic moments where light and sound were invading the still darkness, Stinker turned, quickly loping off away from the garden, away from the house. It knocked over one of the bins, and after about half an hour of people complaining loudly to no one in particular, passive-aggressively hoping for arguments, it seemed it was gone. I went back to the night, drifting off in my chair again as everything settled down. Come morning, there was a different sort of story. In the garden was a torn bin liner, bits of rubbish strewn out around it. A bin was knocked over, lid slightly open. To anyone else, it simply looked like a bin had fallen, or someone had fly-tipped it, or tried to scrounge for cards or bank details. But what I did notice that day was a number of dead rats and pigeons in the area. Again, in an urban built-up area, you don't think much about this. But with the events of the previous night, it sent a shiver down my spine. Stinker had been here, and frustrated with the lack of scraps for easy pickings, it had turned its hunger, or wrath, on local wildlife in the early hours in the morning. It had come back. At first I questioned how. Why would it even be here? It was a distance from where it was previously, a fair distance from the drain that seemed to be its main territory. But then that got me thinking. Wolves have a hunting range from 50 to 1,000 square miles of territory. So what must the hunting range be for the Stinker? And from its behavior, it was hungry, maybe even a bit desperate. It's a stark reminder that even as humanity sprawls out, it will come into contact with the supernatural and the unknown. And though people may think we're some sort of anathema to the natural world, a lot of creatures will adapt and survive. We see this with foxes, coyotes, bears, who will all happily scavenge bins and gardens, taking advantage of free food where they can. And so too then will the cryptids of the world adapt as we come into contact with them. And that's just a bit more terrifying. The thought that our safe urban sprawls aren't really that safe at all from the beasts and monsters of the untamed wilderness. Mount Rainier National Park Horror Story from 33 Jeffward. In the mid-2000s, I had quite the eerie experience up in Mount Rainier State Park. I was an accountant and I had cashed in some vacation days to take my kids to Mount Rainier, which is a couple hours drive from where we lived. My son and daughter, Nathan and Isabel, 12 and 13 respectively, enjoyed fishing and hiking with their old man. I always felt very lucky to have kids who enjoyed at least a few of my hobbies. We arrived at the cabin rental near the national park and unpacked. I took a nap while Nathan and Isabel played a board game and watched TV. By the early afternoon, we ate some lunch and headed out on a hike in the national park itself. If you've never been to Mount Rainier, it's a beautiful place with breathtaking forests and meadows. That day it was cloudy, with a very light rain coming down, off and on throughout the afternoon. Not wet enough to keep us from hiking. It did help us cool off though, if anything. We soon came upon a pond near a field of tall grass, so we rested and whipped out some fishing rods. Isabel didn't feel like fishing at the moment. She seemed like she'd rather explore the field. I was fine with that. I just reminded her to not stray too far. Also, quick note here, I can't be sure how legal it was for us to fish in that body of water, but I wasn't too worried about being caught. Anyway, we caught nothing after spending half an hour at the pond. I began to pack away the tackle and rods, when suddenly I heard a scream. My parental instincts kicked in, my head jerking up to look in the direction of the scream so quickly I nearly pulled a muscle. That was certainly Isabel's voice. I could see her about 50 yards away. I called her name and ran over to her. She had her hands over her head, as if startled by something. My heart raced, worried she'd hurt herself somehow. "Are you okay?" I panted when I got to her. "Yeah, but..." She pointed at the ground. "Oh God," I gasped. I kid you not, in a small clearing in the grass field lay the decapitated heads of several coyotes, though at first I thought they were dogs. I nearly vomited. But first I pulled Isabel away from the scene so she didn't have to look at it any longer. Of course, my son ran over to us and got a full glimpse first. "Wicked," he said. I rolled my eyes and got all of us back on the trail fast. The three of us discussed what could have done that and why. "Can bears do that? It might have been a bear," Nathan wondered out loud. Doubt it. I don't think bears collect, heads," I told him. Isabel chimed in. "Had to be a person. People are the only things mean enough to do something like that." I couldn't help but agree with her. However, I didn't want to scare them, so I didn't say anything. We were on the home stretch of the trail then, which would lead us to the trailhead near where we parked. Then we could drive back to the cabin. It was then, as the sun was getting low in the sky, that I began to hear something odd. A strange crying sound, like that of a grown man sobbing harshly, the way I would sob if something happened to my children. But why would a grown man be all the way out here alone to cry like that? "Daddy, do you think they need help?" Isabel asked. "Best we mind our own business, hun," I replied, ushering us all onward. Now here's where it gets creepy. As we continued on up the trail for about 10 minutes, which should have been a good bit of distance, we continued to hear the crying sound the entire way. The sobs of a man, yet he sounded no farther from us than before. It was even coming from the same direction, even though we'd changed directions with the trail. It just didn't make sense. With a sigh, I hesitantly called out, "Hello? Do you need help?" Chills went up my spine when the sobbing was immediately replaced by laughter. 5 or 6 seconds of laughter, then silence. My breath caught in my throat from the fear I felt in that moment. Then suddenly, rapid, heavy footsteps from the nearby trees caught my attention. They were coming right at me, fast. The moment someone should have burst through the foliage and onto the trail directly in front of me, the footsteps instead stopped, and a feeling of being watched attached itself to me. "We need to hurry, guys," I told the kids. We sped up our pace, soon making it back to the parking area within the next hour. As we exited the trailhead, I made the mistake of turning around to look back. It was sunset. The shadows were at their longest, but I could clearly see it. A figure. This is going to sound crazy, but to keep truthful to my memory and to the story, I will describe it just as I saw it that day. It was humanoid, built like an athletic man, but this man stood about 8 feet tall, I could tell because there was a sign near him we had passed, which was quite close to my height, and I'm 6 feet tall. This figure towered over it. His legs seemed to bend backwards at the knees, and there was something up with his head. I want to say it looked as if he had horns, but it was getting dark, and I hoped it was just an odd hairstyle. My heart lurched in my chest painfully, causing me to fly forward with the kids in tow. I forced them into the car as fast as possible. They kept asking if I was okay as we sped away, but I didn't answer until halfway back to the cabin. Even then, I just told them I didn't feel right. Later in their adult years, I would end up telling them this entire story, just like I've shared it with you here. In the end, I have no idea what that figure was, or if all the events on that hike that day were even connected. But altogether, they made for a terrifying nightmare of a hike. Beware Mount Rainier National Park. There is something out there. Something that clearly isn't human. It's been over a decade now. You can take your chances, but it could still be there after all these years.
Pantry Ghost from Weston K. This story is about 2 spooky events that happened to my brothers. I'll need to first explain the layout of my family's basement. This isn't your typical creepy dark basement down some rickety wooden steps. The house is built on the side of a valley, which means half of the basement is not underground. There's a sliding glass door you can use to enter it from outside. Directly in front of this door, across the living room where we watch TV, is a storm shelter with a doorway but no door. This takes place in Arkansas, so houses have tornado shelters. Inside this room is a refrigerator and sink. Then there's a door to the right leading into our pantry. Outside the shelter, to the left, is a hallway leading down to my brother's bedroom. The first strange thing occurred when one of my brothers, I'll call him T, entered the basement through the glass door at night. Keep in mind that 5 of my brothers live here and all share the room at the end of the hall. T entered the house and headed for the bedroom. Then he started to hear rustling in the pantry, like someone was moving boxes. This was pretty common, as my siblings would often hunt for snacks in there. T didn't think too much of it and assumed someone was digging around for a nighttime treat. He didn't even bother to notice whether the light was on in there or not. He says he doesn't remember. However, once he got to the room to retire for the night, he realized that all of the boys were already in there. Dad works the night shift and wasn't home, and Mom usually went to bed earlier and slept upstairs with our 2 little sisters. Considering all this, and the fact that none of the boys were out of the room, it was a little odd that T had heard a noise coming from the pantry. And the sliding glass door wasn't locked, so he and the 2 others went over to look in the pantry. When they did, they, in true horror movie fashion, found no one there. The next night, one of my other brothers, I'll call him Q, had an unexplained encounter. He was getting up to go to the bathroom, which was located beside the storm shelter at the end of the hall. When he stepped out into the corridor and looked down towards the bathroom, he thought he saw a figure move from the exercise equipment at the back of the room into the shelter. He describes this figure as having long, black hair, a white t-shirt, and black shorts. As you can guess, no one we know matches this description. Q still went to the bathroom, but straight back to the bedroom after, without looking in the pantry. This was very recent, so I'll update this entry if anything else happens. They now joke that Michael Jackson is haunting us. I had just bought a reprint of the piano shirt he was wearing in the music video for Beat It, after all. Update. Several days later, one of my other brothers, I'll refer to him as G, heard stuff crashing and falling in the storage room at the end of the hall near the bedroom. When he looked inside, he noticed that the door to the room inside of the storage room that houses the hot water heater was open. It was always kept shut. That room was small, but big enough for multiple people to hide in. Some days later, G and another brother I'll call L were watching a movie on the computer upstairs. They started to hear T talking in the downstairs living room. They went down there and found that T was not actually down there. In fact, he was at work. Not only that, no one else was down there. The entire basement was empty. These were some sporadic and random odd occurrences that happened recently. Whether they're tied together or not, I don't know. I just thought I'd leave them here.
The Others. From Addy410. I grew up in rural England, and as a child, I loved spending my summers outside in the woods behind my house. That was until what I call the incident. It all started when my friend was staying over for a few nights. I was 13 at the time. My parents had gone into London to see my nan, who had just suffered a stroke. I'd always been a confident child, didn't fear much, or so I thought. My friend arrived at about 5 in the afternoon. We were planning on spending the rest of the daylight hours in the woods. And that's what we did, for about 2 hours. As we were just messing around out there, we came to an abrupt stop. We heard someone screaming in the distance. It was loud and screechy, like a bird, but you could tell it was a human, or something with a human-like scream. That's when the whole forest fell eerily silent. My friend and I just stood there, confused. Suddenly, about 5 to 15 people all began doing the same screaming sound that the first person had done. It was horrendous. We got back to the house in a hurry, and we tried to go straight to bed. But it was no use. The screaming must have gone on for at least 40 minutes before, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. My friend and I were puzzled over what the screaming could be, but eventually sleep won us over. Fast forward about 4 hours to around 2 in the morning. I got up to grab a drink of water. My friend was still fast asleep. I crept downstairs into the kitchen, grabbed my glass, and filled it up. I left the kitchen with my glass to go look out our sliding door. But I froze then. Lined along the tree line was about 30 people, all wearing some kind of bird mask. I know for a fact there were even children in the line, as some of the people were much shorter than the others. I darted back upstairs to wake my friend. He woke up shortly after. I told him the whole story while we both looked out the window at the bird people. They stayed perfectly in line all night, not moving an inch. In all that fear, we must have fallen asleep again, because when I woke up, they were gone. Just in case I thought it was a dream, we went outside the next day, and we found several items of clothing and about 14 sandals, clearly from different people as there were odd pairs. This is just a reminder to always trust your instincts. Who knows what would have happened had we stayed out there too long. I truly don't know what we saw that night, but one thing's for certain, they haven't come back, and that's probably for the best. Ghost Soldier, from Austin L.M. As most 10-year-olds go, I was pretty average. I liked all the normal things 10-year-olds like. Sports, dirt, a strong disdain for anything girly. I had a friend who I was extremely close with. We would have sleepovers at each other's homes and enjoyed the time we got to hang out. This story happened on our last sleepover ever. It marked the end of our friendship. The sleepover was scheduled to happen at my place. I had in mind a number of fun activities that my friend and I would be doing, from playing with Legos to watching movies and eating junk food. After we'd tired ourselves out and were exhausted, my mother quickly got us ready for bed, telling us when the lights had to be out. We got our sleeping arrangements figured out. We would share the bed, him on one side, me on the other, both of us using different pillows and blankets. Before long, we fell asleep. I remember waking up in the middle of the night. I had the strangest feeling, like something was watching me. In my 10-year-old mind, I was going wild, debating if I should open my eyes at all or put my head under the covers, like the terrified kid I was. However, the feeling of terror was replaced with a deep sadness I had never felt before. I felt compelled to open my eyes. I did. At the foot of my bed stood a soldier. He looked as if he was a reenactor for a Civil War battle. Something was wrong, though. The soldier looked like a young man. He had dark hair that was twisted and matted with mud and a deep red substance. I couldn't really tell what his original hair color was. His skin looked pale, and his cheeks gaunt. He had a sharp-looking nose, like you would expect to see a pair of glasses sitting on. He had these piercing deep blue eyes. His eyes were the most alive-looking part about him. They were full of sadness. He looked lost, kind of like a 1,000-yard stare. I eventually began to smell the distinct scent of copper in the air. I looked away from his face, trying to see where the smell was coming from. I looked down at his chest, seeing a bloody mess instead. Bones were sticking out, blood looked like it was actively flowing through the wounds. I'd never seen so much gore before, and I was instantly compelled to puke, but couldn't move to do so. I was rooted to the spot on my bed. It got worse, though. The next part is the hardest part to tell. I've never felt like this before or since this part of the story. The soldier's eyes seemed to then register that someone was looking at him. The sad and empty look in his eyes was replaced with a mixture of pain and fear. He started grabbing at his chest and screaming. He screamed for his mother. He screamed for God to take his pain away. He screamed for help. Then he cursed God, begged for mercy, cried out, not wanting to die alone. He cried that he was afraid. I closed my eyes because it was too much for me to take. Eventually, it got quiet. At that point, I opened my eyes, but the soldier was still there, blood coming from his mouth and eyes. He was crying and murmuring words I could not understand. I tried to move, and I found my head could move from side to side. I looked towards where my friend was, and to my shock, he was awake as well. He was wide-eyed and looked like he was silently crying. I then felt tears of my own. I closed my eyes and found myself waking up to early morning light and the smell of breakfast. My friend and I woke up at the exact same time. We didn't need to say anything because we both had that look in our eyes, letting the other know we both saw it. We never did hang out again. Our friendship quickly withered away after the event. I found myself looking into the history of that area. I could find nothing about any significant battles or events that happened there. However, I did learn that a number of skirmishes were had by Union soldiers and Confederate guerrilla soldiers that infiltrated the area with the goal of disrupting Union supplies and reinforcements. Maybe this was one of the poor souls who had died in one of those skirmishes, left alone to die in pain and fear. I feel as though I had seen all the stages of grief in the dying moments of that soldier. All stages but acceptance. Every time I find myself thinking about that poor man, I say a prayer, and I hope he found peace.
The Banshee in the Bog, from Celtic Kin. Irish folklore is littered with mysterious and terrifying creatures, the kind that sound so unbelievable but are spoken of with such conviction that you can't help but wonder if there must be a layer of truth buried in there. Old people in particular still hold a belief in the fairy folk and the lore of ancient Ireland. Before she passed away, my grandmother would sit us down in her cottage and fill its walls with tales of all kinds of spirits, from silently watchful black hounds to the kelpie, a water horse that would seduce you into riding it before it departed into the depths of the lake or loch, galloping into its murky depths. When my parents would collect us, Mum would scowl upon finding out about the ghost story session, knowing that neither my brother nor I would be getting much sleep that night. Nevertheless, I cherish these fireplace memories as they take me back to a simpler time when the dark winter evenings would be filled with life in the form of Granny's lifting, aged voice. My favorite of these creatures, or least favorite, I suppose, given the endless amount of nightmares it implanted into my mind as a child, was the Banshee, a spirit tied to particular families. Legend has it that she appears in different forms, but tends to favor that of either a beautiful but distraught woman, or a hunched, ailing older woman if it appeared by sight at all. It is even more distinct, you see, by its unearthly cry. Its wails and weeps would fill a room or be audible from miles away across the countryside. The person who crosses paths with the Banshee or its cry should quickly alert the family, as this is a signal that someone from the family has died or is set to die. Yes, the Banshee is an omen of death. As I grew older, I became cynical about the tales my grandmother had spouted, including that of the Banshee. I moved to the city for university at 18 and, immersing myself in the modern world, the ways of country life seemed to evaporate. A small-scale reflection of the increasingly modernizing world, I guess. Sad when you think about it, isn't it? That was until one particular summer. My parents had recently downsized to a small cottage deep in the barren Irish West, where the roar of city life was inaudible. I stayed with my parents for the month of July and spent long, languid days roaming the nearby fields and looking out for signs of wildlife, such as foxes that roamed late at dusk, or the bats that flew low along the lanes, which were laden with sprawling plant life. My story begins, I suppose, in the second week of my stay. I had taken to going for twilight walks, making the most of our northern sun, which can see daylight lasting until close to 11 p.m. I was miles away from the house, but could sense darkness approaching and decided to make my way home. Nighttime in that part of the country is utterly dark and not something you want to find yourself swallowed by. It was as I was walking back that I heard it. The most startling, biting cry. It seemed to fill the world around me as though echoing against stone walls, even though I was surrounded by open nature. I can try to describe it by saying that it was, on one hand, the sound of a woman in sharp pain, but equally that of a grieving mother sobbing at the loss of her child. I was momentarily horrified. In one moment, it seemed that all of my cynicism was laid to rest and that I should run home without question. What sort of horrific creature was capable of producing a sound like this? However, I then tried to apply logic. After all, can't foxes make the most spine-tingling noises when they're distressed, or even in heat? There had to be a purely natural explanation for this, in spite of how undisputedly unnatural it sounded. Whatever it was, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I would run home, I decided, and alert my parents, just in case someone was genuinely in distress or harm. I began to pick up my pace, breaking into a jog, but something in the peripheries of my vision brought me to a sharp and sudden stop. To my left was bogland, an area that I had been warned never to walk in, as it would be all too easy to sink into the wet ground and become stuck or even suffocated. It was shocking to me, therefore, that in the midst of this bogland stood a woman, long silvery blonde hair twisting in the evening breeze. The relative distance and encroaching darkness made it hard to make her out entirely, but she looked to be in her early to mid-20s, my age, and her face was contorted in what looked like either pain or horror. It was from her mouth I realized that the bone-chilling screams were emerging. Initially, I was stunned. This was so adverse to anything I had experienced in this part of the world so far, which seemed so devoid of alarm or drama or consequence. But I shook myself then and called out to the woman as loudly as I could. Hello? What's wrong? Are you stuck? She seemed to register me, small eyes turning in my direction, but there was no response aside from the continuous screech which now pounded in my head. Hello? I'm going to try and get help. I'll be back as soon as I can. With that, I ripped my eyes from the woman and darted back to the house as quickly as I could. I was around a mile away, but phone signal was limited in that part of the country, and I knew I'd need to get home in order to do something to assist the woman. It would have been a risk to my own life to have walked across the bogland towards her. When I got home, my parents' warm faces quickly dropped to looks of alarm upon seeing me.
What is it? You look as if you've seen a ghost.
I quickly filled them in on what I'd seen, and they sprang into action, grabbing the phone and alerting the local Garda, our police force. In the meantime, my father and I leapt into the car to make our way back to the spot, while my mother waited for the Garda to arrive. By car, we were there within minutes, and I quickly directed my father to where I had seen the incident. I pride myself on my sense of direction, and the lane is fairly straightforward, so I was utterly bemused when I realized that there was no woman in sight, nor any sound within earshot, bar the standard noises of a country evening. We scanned the area, but still nothing. When my mother arrived with the constable, he questioned me about where I had seen the woman and raised his eyebrow when I said that she was no longer there.
There's no way she could have been submerged in that space of time. You said she was standing fully upright when you saw her, right?
That's right. She was still a bit of a distance away, but it didn't look like her legs were submerged at all. It was the screaming that made me run for help. He nodded.
Okay, son, thank you. Could you very clearly tell me once again exactly what you saw? Try not to miss anything out.
I did so, relaying the story to him again, and trying to interpret his facial reactions as I did so. He remained quite neutral, writing my account onto his notepad. When I finished, he paused before speaking slowly.
Right. I'm going to say first that given how few people live around here, I myself can't say that I know anyone fitting that description. I like to think I know each and every one around these parts. However, I'm going to file a report and investigate this further. It might be that she got herself free and walked off again.
He stopped and bit the end of his pen, looking thoughtful before continuing with some visible discomfort.
I want to thank you for alerting me about this. I just want to say, though, before I set off, I've heard of cases like this in the past. Figures, women, appearing around the countryside and alarming a passerby with their cry. Well, again, officially, I'm going to handle this as I'd handle any other case, but I want you to do me a favor. Check in with your family this evening and see how they're doing. It might sound odd, but can you do that for me?
Dad looked perplexed at this, and seemed like he was going to ask further questions, but Mum interjected, nodding.
Yes, officer, I think I understand you. We'll do that.
With that, we drove home. The darkness of the land around us was impenetrable, aside from the light of the car's full beam. It was a moonless night. We didn't need to contact our family members that evening. Well, we got in contact, but what I mean to say is that they reached us first. My mother's brother-in-law had sent her a message when we'd been out. The message wasn't long. It simply read, "Hi, Bridget. Tried to contact you, but no reply. Please call." When Mum got through, she was distraught to find out that her sister had passed away that evening. It had been a sudden medical event that nobody had predicted. Aunt Sarah had been living with her husband and family in the USA for years. We saw her biannually most years, but the death shook us up nevertheless. In the days that followed, we sprung into action, assisting with funeral arrangements in whatever way we could and booking flights to Boston. I didn't voice it to my parents, not wanting to upset them further, but I couldn't help but consider the incident with the woman in the bog and what the officer had said to us. My logical mind tried its best to protest, but my memory kept tiptoeing back to the stories my grandmother had told me years ago, particularly those of the Banshee. Was it possible that this could have been the explanation? Was the woman in the field trying to alert me, to warn me about the impending death of my aunt? It took 2 years for me to bring this up to my mother. I was once again visiting home, and we were drinking tea in the garden. It was yet another summer evening at twilight, and I was taken back to that night by the bog. I voiced my memories to Mum and asked her if she remembered what the constable had said. She gazed into her teacup, sighed, and looked up at me slowly.
Yes, son, I remembered. Do you recall me telling him that I thought I might understand?
Yes, Mum, I do.
Your dad was ready to question him. Oh, well, this might sound crazy to you, but I did understand. You see, about 3 years before that, something similar had happened.
I took an intake of breath, and she must have seen my eyes widen.
Oh, no, I didn't see a woman, if that's what you think. But I did hear a cry from within the walls of our old home on the evening your granny passed away, as though someone was screaming deep inside the house. Of course, the difference is that we were prepared that time. We knew it was only a matter of days or hours. But I did hear the cry. It terrified me at the time. It's part of the reason we sold up and moved to this cottage.
I was dumbstruck. When I finally found my voice, I told her I hoped that she hadn't come to hate the new house too, following what I had seen 2 years before.
Oh, no,
she responded.
No, I actually think it's helped me deal with the first occasion, believe it or not. You see, I think maybe it's not a bad thing. She was distressed, you say, when you saw her there. The woman in the bog, I mean. Well, perhaps she was just as sad as we were. Perhaps she's just part of the family. I do wonder if anyone has seen or heard her in the past. Your grandmother, well, you remember her stories. I used to grimace when I came home to you and your brother shuddering on her sofa. I still stand by that.
She smiled wistfully at me as she said this, and I was transported back to the corner of the old sofa.
But it could be that she knew there was some truth behind what she was saying. Perhaps your grandmother, my mother, had seen our sad friend too.
With that, she finished her tea, lifted both cups from the table, and walked to the sink, leaving me filled with thoughts, nostalgia, and an overwhelming sense of closeness to my own family, culture, and land that I hadn't felt before.
The Freaky Fence, from NicoDawg. I'm the oldest of 2 siblings. My younger brother and sister are twins and are about 3 years younger than me. The house we grew up in was your typical small family home in a fairly rural town outside Seattle. The house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, and next to it was a large bog that we would always lose baseballs and tennis balls in. We were pretty fortunate that we never had any ghosts or monsters roaming about, but there was one incident I specifically remember that was bizarre, and looking back, I get chills thinking about it. Growing up, my brother and I shared a room upstairs. Our room had a window that overlooked the backyard. In our backyard, there was a large fence which separated our backyard from a neighborhood hiking trail. There were a ton of trees, and off to the right was the bog. The night when the incident occurred, I would have been around 8 years old, and my brother 5. Our parents sent us off to bed, and although we were supposed to be going to bed, we sat in our beds talking for a while. It was a hot summer night, so our window was open. I remember feeling the occasional small breeze, a welcomed relief in our room. I eventually began to doze off, but I remember hearing my brother moving around in his bed, apparently trying to get comfortable. At one point, I heard him sit up in bed. I flipped over to face him, and I saw him sitting by the window, staring out. All of a sudden, his facial expression turned to that of pure terror. I didn't know how to react, so I sat back in my bed, asking him, "Are you okay?" He didn't reply. Instead, he just sat there in shock. After about 15 seconds, he suddenly jolted in his seat and began to scream. My brother was quite the crier growing up, but this was a different cry from what was normal for him. My dad then rushed into the room and turned on the lights. By this point, my brother was crying hysterically. Our dad at first thought I'd hurt him or tried to scare him, but he quickly realized by my confused and frightened look that I had about as much of a clue of what happened to my brother as he did. He tried to console my brother, who would not stop screaming. My mom and sister came into the room as well. After my dad settled him down enough, my brother tried to explain what he saw. Now, he was young and not great with words, but he described seeing what he called a freaky fence. My parents figured he must have had a nightmare. Maybe he saw an animal or something. So he went to sleep with them that night, leaving me alone in the room. Throughout the night, I would hear the wind pick up, and each time I wanted to look in the backyard, but I was so scared I couldn't build up the courage to do it. This was the only weird thing that ever happened in that house. As years passed, the freaky fence became somewhat of an inside joke in my family. We would all poke at my brother for getting so spooked that night, but he never really laughs much more than an uncomfortable chuckle. Eventually, everyone seemed to forget about it. We're adults now, and my siblings and I are still very close. Recently, I was hanging out with my brother, and we were reminiscing about our childhood. I remembered that night, so I jokingly asked him about the freaky fence. His look instantly grew cold. Here's what he told me. It was a hot night, man. I kept feeling a breeze and hearing the wind blow a little since the window was open. During one of those breezes, I thought I heard a distant, low moan. You remember, we had a lot of animals in our yard from time to time, deer, raccoons. So I looked out the window to see what it was. At first, I didn't see anything. It was dark, but I soon saw something terrifying. This large figure came out of the fence. I know it sounds weird, but I promise it just emerged from the ground at the base of the fence. This thing was massive, whatever it was. It moved across the backyard and stopped. Suddenly, it craned its neck, and I saw 2 red eyes looking around, staring at our house. I froze. I couldn't move, because I was afraid it would see me through the window. After a couple of seconds, I watched it walk parallel to the house and disappear into the bog. As soon as it was out of sight, I felt my breath come back to me, and I started to scream, because I truly could not explain what I just saw. I'll tell you, Whatever that thing was, it absolutely terrified me, and still does to this day. Thanks for listening to Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed the show, you can support us in a number of other ways. You can go to eeriecast.store to buy some creepy t-shirts or coffee mugs. Go to eeriecast.com to listen to and follow this show and our other scary podcasts on your favorite podcasting app, or follow me on Twitter @DarkPrevails for more screams and memes. Before I go, be sure to send me your scariest stories of the unexplained at darkstories.org. Until next time, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.